I told the court that I'm wrongfully imprisoned.
Mr. Soon, you are not to
You have to
address
hear
the
me.
jury.
There's too much being hid from you.
He needs to be taken out of the court.
There's too much.
He was one small man in a giant wheel caught.
Well, I do wish to say that it's official that I'm wrongfully imprisoned right now.
Uncover, Season 7, Dead Wrong.
I asked him if he killed Pippo. He said yes, and I'd be next.
Available on CBC Listen and wherever you get your podcasts. This is a CBC podcast.
I'm Elamin Abdul Mahmoud, and this is Pop Chat. There's Loki, Lupin, Cruella, Fast and the Furious 9, Black Widow. So many of this summer's new releases are spin-offs and recycled IP. So we take on that big question. Is Hollywood actually running out of ideas? Plus, we'll discuss Islamophobia in pop culture. And then, of course, as always, we'll drop something in the group chat. We'll be sharing what we've been watching or reading or listening to this week. So much to get to, so let's do it. Hi, pals, and welcome to the show. With me today, we have Hussein Kesvani, writer and podcaster. Hello, Hussein.
Hi, how's it going?
I'm well, pal. Welcome. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's very muggy here in London, so just kind of getting through this uncharacteristically warm weather after a very long period of it just raining and being cold all the time.
Gotta say, I cannot relate because it is a beautiful time, beautiful springtime here in Toronto. Sarah Haggie, I hope you agree, writer, culture critic. Hello, Sarah.
Hi. Yeah, it's all right. It's all right out today. It's raining a bit.
No, but this is the vibe, man.
It's been nice. It's been nice.
What's even nicer than the weather is hanging out with the two of you as we try to process some stuff that happened. So do you want to do that together?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I like processing stuff.
Last week, Dana Schwartz wrote a piece about the parade of blockbuster franchises coming out this summer, and the piece kind of hit a nerve. People had very strong feelings about it. So in the piece, Dana Schwartz pushes back against all this criticism that Hollywood gets for its focus on superhero movies, its focus on all this recycled IP, just the stuff that keeps recurring sequel after sequel, origin story after origin story, and the idea that this is a death of filmmaking. It's truly a hot take in the sense that it lit up the internet. Schwartz basically argued that the film industry has kind of always been sustained by adaptation and that making money is not at odds with creativity. So here's a quote from the piece. The unfortunate byproduct of the industry is that our best and most exciting artists are moving to marquee IP projects because that's where the resources are. Chloe Zhao and Taika Waititi are making Marvel movies. Cruella was co-written by Tony McNamara. The film industry is going to continue to evolve and change, but until art is a public good, artists will have to work within that system, and I think it's worth celebrating and continuing to champion good work when they achieve it, and also get paid for it. So all of that should also be contextualized with the idea that Dana Schwartz herself is writing an upcoming Marvel series for Disney+. But I wonder if actually there's some kind of truth to what she's saying here, and I want to get into that. Hussein, I'm going to start with you. What do you think about this idea that Marvel hegemony's good, actually?
Yeah, it's not, obviously this isn't the first time someone has said this. We know that Martin Scorsese wrote that essay last year. It feels like a long time ago, but it was actually not that long ago.
Yes.
Where he was sort of talking about Marvel as more of an experiential kind of concept and one that isn't quite cinema. And that's not, and he kind of qualified it by saying, but look, I'm not saying that these movies are all bad. But they don't classify as cinema because they kind of are part of this broader corporate infrastructure. And he
called them theme parks. Theme parks.
And he's completely right about that. And I think my opinion very much matches his and Dana's as well, in the sense of I'm not, I don't think that the Marvel movies are bad in and of themselves. I enjoyed a bunch of them. I enjoyed a bunch of the spin-offs. I thought Falcon and the Winter Soldier was really good. I thought that, WandaVision had some good parts as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he's kind of right in the sense that, if we're talking about movies that are designed to make money and designed to really be kind of conversation starters. Like the things that we talk about on podcasts like this, they are more often than not Marvel films. And I think that's ultimately to say that, like, it's not to say that there isn't creativity in the film industry, because there is. And as you mentioned, there are like some very good and very talented directors who are working on Marvel projects. What seems to be more of a case is that if you really want to experiment and you want to experiment with form or narrative, then it feels like more often than not, the way to kind of do that and have like the freedom and flexibility to experiment with ideas is to incorporate Marvel IP and franchises and products into your projects. I feel like it's very, and I feel like it's part of this broader conversation about film and maybe like other aspects of entertainment that are just very reluctant to make new stuff.
Haggy, I'm curious about this idea of Marvel and Disney being, like, if you think about it, you know, Ryan Coogler makes Fruitvale Station, goes on to make Black Panther. It becomes a way to elevate talent that we're seeing out in the wild. If you have a movie that gets a lot of good reviews, you're kind of rewarded with a Marvel movie. People are willing to invest a whole bunch of money in you so that you can make a large scale project. Is that a disingenuous way to see this? Like, is that, I don't know, am I missing something here?
Yeah, I definitely do. And honestly, like, I really strongly disliked Dana's piece. I thought it was just full of, you know, arguments that aren't real. And I will say that, you know, when it comes to something different happening or breaking through, like that, I don't think that is true anymore. Like, I mean, like you said, like, Ryan Coogler has to make something like Fruitvale Station and it gets really great reviews and everyone really loves it. And then he gets to make a Marvel movie. Like, that isn't, to me, a reward. It's a monetary reward, but it isn't a reward itself. Like, I think if anything, it's really sad because it shows that nothing small or that isn't a tentpole or has this giant IP potential can get made by a big studio. Like, a movie like Erin Brockovich was a major studio movie. A movie about a lawyer who is, you know, doing this, like, she's not a lawyer, but like someone working on a legal case about water contamination. Like, that was a big studio movie back in the day. Like, you could never have that happen now. It always has to be like a small indie movie or like an indie studio or whatever. Like, even, yeah, like all these like A24 movies that are become quite huge, like they're considered indie, you know what I mean?
Right.
So to me, it's like, it is really depressing to think about it in that sense, where it's like, yeah, movies can get made, but like they're not going to get the backing that they used to.
But I mean, if I can just push back on that a little bit, we've seen the at least critical and also industry success of like a Nomadland, of like a Moonlight, in terms of being recognized as like, this is a towering sort of piece of art. And then when you make those movies, those artists do tend to get like some recognition, and then studios say, okay, we're still willing to work with you and fund some more of your movies. So has the path for breaking through changed that much, do you think?
I don't know if the path for breaking through has changed that much, but like it does say something that you have to make something like a Moonlight or Nomadland that were nominated for so many Oscars to get another chance to make something great. And Barry Jenkins' first movie was Medicine for Melancholy. They made that with like $15,000. So like it was a long time coming for him to get his Moonlight moment.
Now, here's the thing, Hussein. As much as we maybe hate to admit it, I mean, I don't know if you hate to admit it, but like, these big movies work. Like, people go see them. People will line up to see them. I would like to line up in a very long line around the block to see the Fast 9 movie. Like, I just desperately want this. They make a lot of money because we watch them. So why would Hollywood stop making them?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Like, I was thinking about this like a lot today. And just the contradiction of like really kind of liking aspects of these sort of franchise movies that work, but also being aware that like these elements that we really like have been kind of designed and tested to make sure that we kind of elicit the sort of response that is like the return on investment, right? And I think that ultimately a lot of this is down to economics, to like, you know, be very frank. It's kind of about how studios get funding, how investors get funding, and how often like film investment is so linked to tech investment, and how like risk averse these creative industries are in relation to these tech companies that have a lot of money and play like wild and loose with them, because the tech companies, like places like Amazon, for example, but also places like Netflix, who have been able to borrow money very, very cheaply for the past decade, for them, like the kind of target is dominance, and it's about dominance of their technologies and dominance of their platforms. And for Amazon, like literal dominance of the internet. And then every so often, because these tech companies have so much money to play with, they might like throw a bone to like make an indie film that like is pretty decent. Or they might kind of like make a kind of like half decent film that the reaction is like, oh, I can't believe that Amazon like produced something like this, or I can't believe Netflix produced like something like this. Ultimately, I think the big fear is not like that we find superhero movies too entertaining, because that's what they're designed to do. It's the fact that like tech companies are ultimately deciding what types of films can be produced, and I think that's unprecedented.
So like taking that to its most logical extension, Haggy, we start to see the problem is not in the creativity of movies being made, it's the creativity of movies that are making it to the movie theater. Like the movie theater as an institution has been changing for a long time, and of course like that is to be expected. But as we think about this sort of idea of the future of the movie theater and what that looks like if movie theaters are to survive the pandemic, it's not going to be because of a $20 million movie that looks like Aaron Brockovich. It's going to be because of a $200 million movie that is a superhero movie. Those seem to be the things that movie theaters are designed for, now that we've introduced this challenge from streaming networks that are like, that's where I'm going to watch an Aaron Brockovich kind of movie. And like Netflix is very happy to sort of fund those middle of the road / olden days relatively expensive movies, but leave the really expensive stuff for like a Disney.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think I feel like there are different trends as well on like what people want to see. Like, I mean, even when you think about Marvel movies, it feels like 5 years ago, people weren't like embarrassed by them. You know what I mean? Like you weren't thinking like, oh my God, like this Marvel loser. It wasn't really like the same thing.
Yeah.
Trend wise, like I really feel like people are kind of getting sick of it. Like even when something like Cruella is announced, it's like, the first thing that everyone said was like, oh, this is interesting, but like, is it necessary? Do I need to see this kind of thing? And that seems like it was a huge response of people I know who actually saw it. And they were just kind of like, it was just, hey, look how much money Disney has.
But I think that's like part of like the big thing is also just like, and the fact that like Disney and Marvel and like all these other big production houses can just make whatever. I think that's also like part of the objective too, because like one thing I was thinking about was when you think of like all these types of films that recycle IP, and I was especially thinking about things like the new Space Jam, where they've just like taken a whole load of IP and just like just put them together in like these very weird like compositions. A lot of it is participatory, right? It's kind of like it's designed to, these films are designed to get us to talk about them, whether we talk about them in a good way or not, right? Whether like, all the kind of discourse about is Cruella just like girl boss Joker? I think really like helped to kind of promote the film, even if it wasn't the type of promotion that like is conventional. And I think that like there are a lot of smart people at Disney and Marvel that kind of know how social media platforms work and how information is distributed and like how things are talked about. And they kind of know that like any press is good press, and ultimately it works. And when you have that much money to play with, whether you make kind of a small win at the box office or a big win at the box office, it doesn't really matter. And again, it goes back to this whole thing about like effectively tech and entertainment companies, or entertainment companies that have just become tech companies, like setting the boundaries and setting the goalposts for what defines a successful film, and in so doing like marginalizing lots of conventional like film producers and filmmakers.
I feel like a big part of the reaction that Knives Out got was that it wasn't one of these tentpole. It wasn't like sort of a pre-established IP. And people were like, they went and saw it. They didn't think it was a perfect movie. They're like, this is pretty good. I was entertained by a story that did not come from a Disney. And it was, as you were mentioning earlier, Haggy, it's like this movie that a studio was like, you can have $40 million to make this movie. And then they ended up making $300 million out of it. They're now doing a Knives Out 2, which is like, God, you ruined it. Like it was kind of the standalone good thing, and now it's being ruined. But I think the idea of it not being a pre-established IP was compelling to people.
I think yes and no, because I mean, like, who got to make the Knives Out? It was Ryan Johnson,
Rian
who
Johnson.
makes Star Wars movies. It's kind of like, oh yeah, like he was able to make Star Wars movies. People love him. Let's let him do like, a frankly entertaining but pretty mediocre when you think about it too hard kind of movie. And again, it's kind of like who gets chances to take chances, you know?
Yeah.
I think there's just like so much to prove to be like, hey, like I want to make a movie about this real life woman who exposed all this like crazy water stuff. Like, you know what I mean? Like, but that's never gonna, like, that just doesn't happen anymore. Like, even if a huge star is in it, it's like totally pushed aside, or it's like this, it's still a risk, you know what I mean? Which is crazy to think about.
There are also like, I was just thinking about like films that are sort of in that vein. And they're not great films, but like I think there was that there was that Adam Driver film about like the Iraq War secrets. I can't remember what it was called. Yeah, and that was like an Amazon product. There was like a similar one with like Shailene Woodley, which was like about Guantanamo detainees. That was also an Amazon thing. So even when you do have these like films with kind of fairly big names that are kind of tackling social issues, or like important international issues, they're kind of, again, these are kind of films that are still supported by the same tech infrastructure that has given us the situation where of like Marvel dominance and, franchise dominance.
Yeah, and also like a lot of these movies just get purchased by a Netflix or a Amazon Prime, and then they're just kind of buried and you don't really get to see them. Like, you know what I mean? There's no real promotion. There's no like real good press tour or anything like that. And it's just kind of this movie that exists that you end up like turning on by chance. And then you're like, oh, this movie was interesting. It was really good or something. Anyway, I just find it all really depressing. Like, I just can't believe that there's a world in which someone's writing an article where they're defending Cruella. Like, to me, that's just like the saddest thing in the world. It's like, Cruella doesn't need your defense. It has Disney money.
I would be bummed out, but I have Fast 9 and then Black Widow to look forward to this summer, so I am happy as a clam. Thank you, Haggy.
Hi, I'm Sadaf.
And I'm Sarah.
And we are two very good friends who love gossip and celebrity scandals.
We're also the hosts of a new podcast called The Reheat. We're going to use our experience as cultural journalists to provide you with in-depth analysis of all the stories you remember and some that you don't.
Bennifer to Brangelina.
The time Princess Anne was almost kidnapped.
Ooh, and what about Whitney? Crack is whack, Sarah.
Listen to The Reheat on July 26th on the Frequency Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
This week, Riz Ahmed announced a new initiative to combat what he calls the problem of Muslim misrepresentation on screen. Here he is introducing the project. It's titled Missing and Maligned, the Reality of Muslims in Popular Global Movies.
I didn't always think this way. I thought that progress was linear and inevitable. But a survey of American politics over the last decade will tell you how misplaced that assumption is. Progress is not linear and is not inevitable. I always believed in the model of the 3 stages of representation. It was a kind of model I proposed in an essay in The Guardian a couple of years ago, that any minority group's representation in our culture follows these 3 stages: the stereotype, stage 1, the subversion of the stereotype, stage 2, and then the promised land, stage 3. And I'll explain what they are. Stage 1 is the kind of stuff I didn't want to do when I started acting. I just decided I wasn't going to go into the audition room, say Allahu Akbar, and pretend to detonate myself. Those caricatures, those 2-dimensional portrayals, those Apu from The Simpsons roles. Those situations where you're in an audition room where everyone looks like you, no one wants to be there, and everyone's forced into the role of a terror suspect. That's stage 1. Stage 2 were the kind of films that I did a lot early on in my career, and I'm really proud of. Films like Four Lions, Road to Guantanamo, Reluctant Fundamentalist, even The Night Of. And stage 2, these subversions of the stereotype, take place in this culturally specific, politicized, maybe even post 9/11 landscape, but they're actually trying to battle these 2-dimensional caricatures, these stereotypes. And as my career moved on to stage 3, the promised land, where I got to play Ruben Stone in Sound of Metal, Bodhi Rook in Star Wars, or Carlton Drake in Venom, or even where I was either non-Muslim or unremarkably Muslim, I felt that, wow, we're in a promised land, but I realized we aren't in a promised land. I'm in a bubble. And as my career shifted, my experience at airports didn't get much better than my experience at Luton Airport after Road to Guantanamo. In fact, my experience at airports continued to resemble those early audition rooms. I moved into an interrogation room this time rather than an audition room, but everyone looks like me, no one wants to be there, and everyone is forced into the role of a terror suspect. There's a handful of us in this promised land now, and I say literally a handful, I could count them all on one hand. But the promised land is a lonely place to be, and it's a hollow place to be if most of the rest of your people are stuck in a version of hell. The progress that's being made by a few of us doesn't paint an overall picture of progress if most of the portrayals of Muslims on screen are still either non-existent or entrenched in those stereotypical, toxic, two-dimensional portrayals.
It's a powerful speech, and in it, Ahmed goes on to stress that positive exceptions don't change the rules. He points to films like American Sniper or The Hurt Locker or Argo as evidence of enduring racist characterizations of Muslims that end up working to dehumanize and demonize that population. This is an important conversation, and I would like to have it. And I would like to begin by saying that we have 3 people on this panel who all don't say Muslim because they say Muslim. Thank God for that. That's a good
it's another
start.
Creeping Sharia episode.
It's another Creeping Sharia episode. I want to get into all of this. I want to get into not the Creeping Sharia part, but all the other parts. But Sarah, I'm going to start first with you. What do you think of the way that Muslims are portrayed on screen?
Oh man, I mean, it's like barely existent, and when it is just like the worst shit you can imagine. I think it's kind of exactly as described in the video, and like I know the Pillars Foundation has like worked really hard to make this project happen, and I think for me, when I think about it, it's not even a matter of better representation. It's like a matter of Muslims actually being the ones to tell the stories and to be making the choices. And even so, stepping outside of what they think people want to see, like it kind of lends to our earlier discussion of it's like, well, people keep making these things because that's what people want to see and that's what makes money. And those are like, the national security stories, oppressed woman needs to be saved, the trauma porn. It's always surrounding those things. And you never really get to see a film of, or a story of just kind of like, oh, this person exists and that's the way it is, or, person happens to be Muslim. I find it's really rare. So, I mean, yeah, it's dark times. It's dark when you think about being so hyper visible and then just like kind of invisible on screen in any real meaningful way.
I mean, speaking of superhero movies, I was recently rewatching the very first Iron Man, and I was like, I don't want to see any of these people on screen. What is happening here? And so to that end, Hussein, like it's like Muslim men in particular. They're terrorists or cab drivers who turn out to be terrorists, and like that continues to be happening. Even though we have huge stars, we have Rami, we have Hassan, we have Riz Ahmed. Why are we still in this mode?
Yeah, it's interesting, and in the UK, like you can add like shopkeeper or like bodega owner and stuff like that into the mix. So even though I would argue that things have sort of gotten slightly better in the sense of like there are Netflix series where they are like Muslim characters who get to not be in those roles. I'm thinking also like if we talk about Marvel movies, I'm thinking about like the second Spider-Man movie where Zohar Rahman plays a hijabi Muslim student who like sort of exists as a background character but kind of made headlines for being like a hijabi character in a mainstream Marvel film who kind of just got to be on vacation and say a couple of lines. So it's sort of gotten a bit better, but my thinking about why these roles still exist is because often we're talking about American made and produced films. And if we think about films and cinema as like a reflection of political anxieties, then these characters reflect those anxieties, those kind of like imperialist anxieties quite adequately. And in order to kind of like profess what's great with America and what's great about like, being in the West, you have to have like a physical representation of what you're against, or what you're trying to assimilate or what you're trying to improve. And that's why we end up still having these archetypes. And like people like Rami and Hassan Minhaj and like Riz Ahmed, they are exceptions to the rule that, and they've done like good and interesting work, but I think it's also worth bearing in mind that even in their creations, I know of Rami, for example, there was like a fair amount of criticism from Muslims both in North America and the UK about how he presented different kinds of Muslims, and sort of even at times that show sort of fell into the whole like modernity versus tradition binary that is sort of set by like studios who are producing this type of kind of like Western orientated content.
So like that's all to be said about the Muslim men that we see represented, Sarah, but like we just don't see Muslim women. Like that representation like does not exist.
I mean, it does and it doesn't, because like on a lot of primetime shows right now, you will see a random hijabi character. Are they a hijabi in real life? No. And you can tell by the way they're wearing the hijab. It's barely, it's like just like no way anyone would ever wear one. And in these shows and movies, the girl always ends up taking off her hijab somehow. You'll see a very amazing viral clip of Grey's Anatomy where one of the Muslim women doctors, who just kind of disappears in the series, apparently someone's bleeding out and they're in their hospital bed, and she takes her hijab off and uses it to like a tourniquet almost to like, so, and you're just
in
like
a hospital.
Yeah, in the hospital, and you're like, you're in a hospital, like there's a sheet right beside you. So it's all really stuff like that. And I think what it comes down to is that they don't see us as people. Like, we're not people who can just be okay with how we are. There's always something to change. There's always like something not quite right with Muslim women. We always need to be freed. And it's like crazy that I'm saying this in 2021, because like since I've been media literate, it's been the exact same thing. So it is like always there as a sprinkle of diversity, and then it's never thought out. And you can tell by the way characters behave. Like even when they pray, it's like no one prays like that. Like your body has never made those movements, and I can tell you do not know how to sit down.
I think of that. I think about that every time that like I remember the very first time I saw a Muslim on like a show made by white people was on 24, and I was like, what are they doing? Like I don't. What is this maneuver that they're doing? And who was the consultant on the show? And it's like there was no one. They're just sort of doing the most menacing thing they could do with their bodies. It was like a very rigid movement. Nothing about it was fluid. It was terrifying to look at. And I was like, oh, this is what you think Muslims do when they like close the door.
Yeah. There was like a similar thing in Superstore, I think, where they had like this Muslim character, and the first time and the only time that the Muslim character is praying, like he's like doing it in a room with people kind of talking in there. I think I can't remember exactly what the scene was, but I remember watching and just being like, this isn't what happens. This isn't how it happens. I don't understand why you're doing this. And I think a lot of it is that. A lot of it is also just like we've had so many conversations about like diversity and the need for diversity that quite often you'll have shows who, and again, like I think a lot of it is down to like monetary issues, who don't want to sort of invest the money into doing like, good storylines for Carol, like treating their, diverse characters as characters. So instead they'll sort of like throw in these like bizarre scenes as a way of like ticking boxes, and really is designed for people to kind of be like, is to avoid these headlines that are like, oh, this show was very white, or this show was very it erased people of color and stuff. Like they do it to kind of like tick these boxes so that they don't like get negative press from, again, like white owned and produced media. But for the people who are like watching this, who are part of these communities, you're sort of just sitting there and like, it's not even offensive. It's just kind of very funny because of how bizarre it is.
Now I want to bring it to, I guess I want to take this to its real world applications for a minute, Haggy, because we are still grieving in this country the tragic murder of a Muslim family in London, Ontario. We know from police that this family was targeted by a person specifically because they were Muslim. He was looking to commit a hate crime. And I guess I want to know what you think about how all these flattened representations of Muslims end up affecting people's ideas of Muslims in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is like one part of a huge problem, and that is that like Islamophobia is literally profitable on every level. Like people have careers based on hating Muslims, on creating fear around Muslims, on saying, and you know, like as someone who's covered these stories, I've seen them speak, and I've gone to these rallies, and it starts off with, you know, very basic concepts like we should be free to do whatever we want in Canada. And then it ends with, and I don't want Sharia law in my land. And like, it's something that we joke about because it's so ridiculous. But it is like a real, you know, it's a real thing. And I think that, I don't know, you know, it's something I grapple with a lot because I hate to think that like representation can fix an issue, because I don't think it can. I don't think we can represent our way out of being killed or being hated. But I do think that, you know, certain shows and depictions of Muslims can set us backwards and can cast a negative light on us when, you know, most of what you see about Muslims is very negative. It's very hateful. And I think that will remain the same way as long as there is only a certain type of story that people see profitable, which is, you know, either having Muslims in the background to, you know, fill a quota and say like, oh, look, we represent everyone. Or when it comes to focusing on Muslims and it becomes, you know, again, like a national security story, someone rejecting their faith, someone who, you know, is always grappling with how much they hate being Muslim and how hard it is. Yeah. And as long as those are the only narratives we're seeing prominently, I think it's always going to be an issue. And I feel like it ties into, you know, that's how people see Muslims. That's just what it comes down to.
I was going to say, like, Hussein, I feel like if I was a young Muslim who was reading, like, I guess, like, viewing pop culture and getting my ideas of what it means to be a Muslim from pop culture, it would be a horrifying experience growing up. You know what I mean? Like, and you literally wrote the book on this. You wrote the book on how people are turning, you know, online to get a different construction of what it means to be Muslim because pop culture has nothing for them to offer. And so what are they finding online that is so different?
The work that I did was in a pre-TikTok era. So I think a lot of them are like using TikTok and, you know, Muslim celebrities and influencers, and like creatives on TikTok, I think are like very, very popular, who are like making their own sort of like short films and experiential, like, you know, comedy skits. Like there's a lot of like Muslim comedians that are, you know, becoming like very popular. I think, you know, when I was writing the book, a lot of it was about, you know, Instagram, and it was a lot of like building Twitter communities, and also funnily enough, like Muslim communities, when they were looking at engaging with pop culture, a lot of them like preferred like watching anime or just animated like features because, you know, it was just like fun, and like they didn't, you know, a lot of them I spoke to didn't necessarily kind of buy into the whole kind of thing about wanting representation or needing representation, but they didn't want to like see themselves on screen just for the sake of seeing themselves on screen. Right. And that's not to say that it goes like that's kind of like universal thing. Like, you know, I did a very kind of small study over a short period of time. And it's not to say that like representation isn't like important, but I think it's like, you know, again, to like reiterate like Sarah's point, and also just this kind of broader conversation, representation alone doesn't kind of achieve any kind of political, you know, it doesn't achieve political outcomes. And I think that ultimately, if you're going to do if you're going to kind of represent Muslim characters accurately and like with nuance and as like human characters, like the whole, you know, there has to be this broader dismantling of like anti-Muslim sentiment in politics and in media and, you know, in other like aspects of how states are run, not just in like Canada, but in the US and like, you know, other parts of the world as well. Like I think India is like a good example of this too. Like, you know, representation isn't going to do much unless you challenge these broader kind of structures of power. And I think like for film industries, which, you know, as we mentioned in the first segment, are often like very dependent on these instruments of power. Like one thing I was thinking about when you mentioned Iron Man was the fact that like so many Marvel movies are like dependent on the US Army, and like the US Army, like, you know, ticks off like a lot of stuff, or at least as far as I know, they used to tick off a lot of stuff, and they were like quite involved when Captain Marvel Captain Marvel was being filmed. Like the US military were very, very heavily involved in like how they were represented. And I think that like if you have an entertainment industry that is so dependent on these aspects of the state, whether that's like the military or the police or like even kind of, you know, violent kind of border structures, you're not going to get that, you know, you're not going to achieve like a representation that is in any way like politically useful.
We should do a proper plug for the book, Hussein. Hussein's book is Follow Me Akhi, The Online World of British Muslims. You should buy it. Good book.
Thank you. Yeah, it's on Hearst Publishers or in Oxford University Press.
Lit. Find it. And Haggy, we'll leave the last word to you because you're literally doing a fellowship about how Muslims are portrayed in pop culture right now. What do you think is going to take to change these stereotypes?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to speak on behalf of my work only because it's still ongoing and there's just so much there. But I think it'll take a lot to change how Muslims are represented on film and Muslim storytelling. I don't think it's just about having Muslims make stories. Again, like, I don't think capitalism is the way to get us out of being hated or being seen better. I think it's about decentering the white gaze, decentering what others think of us, trying to prove we're normal people who are just like everyone else. Like, it's like I'm so sick of that. And I think it's not just about storytellers, it's about people making the decisions. Like, I'm not going to expect every single person greenlighting something to be Muslim or to be well-versed in what it's like to be a Muslim in the West or Islam or anything like that. But I think it's just a matter of knowing, like, hey, like, that, you know, there's more to Muslims than just being Muslim sometimes. I just want to really hammer in that I don't think pop culture is the only way to change stereotypes, because it is really awful that these are the stories we're seeing, but there's a reason why these are the stories we're seeing. And there's a reason why someone felt emboldened to run down a family as they were taking their evening walk. And it's not something that I think, you know, as Muslims, you know, we're all so used to talking about this constantly, you know, every time something crazy happens, we're having the same kind of conversation. And I think a lot of it just isn't in our hands at this point.
I think, changing the story is obviously not everything, but it is probably a good starting point. And to that end, to whoever's listening, I'm sure that Sarah Haggy has an excellent idea for rebooting Little Mosque on the Prairie meets Insecure. So get at her. That's all I'm saying.
I think we should see some Muslims in space. That's what I say. And then we can all have a discussion on which direction we pray in.
Well, on that note, listeners, please let us know what you think.
Where will we go? What direction will we face?
Okay, so before we go, it is time for the best part of the show, which is drop it in the group chat. And this is where we hear what you have been watching or reading or listening to. We also started hearing from listeners, and Lily, one of our listeners, shared with us that she's been listening to Chromio's Quarantine Casanova album. Best pandemic art is what she called it. I feel like that's a big statement, so I'm going to go and listen to that and see what that's all about. Hussein, what would you like to drop in the group chat today?
So I haven't been watching or listening to too much, but one thing I have been very fascinated with, because it was a series that I watched when I was doing some therapy courses, was a show called In Treatment. Which at the time it was about a psychologist called Paul Weston, who was played by Gabriel Byrne, and it was really fascinating because the whole show would just be him having these kind of conversations in therapy settings with characters, including the late Irfan Khan, which was a really great arc. It's been rebooted for a 4th season, in which the psychologist is played by Uzo Aduba. And it's great. I really like it. They've added a lot more drama into it. But it's really just about the kind of parasocial relation or types of relationships that patients have with their therapists, and where those kind of gray lines are, and what kind of classifies as a psychologist going a bit too far and what doesn't. It's a very great, it's a really interesting show, especially for pandemic watching, and just for anyone who's been in therapy or been interested in therapy.
The relieving thing to me about In Treatment is that I don't have to start at season 1 in order to just kind of join in the show, because each season is sort of its own arc, and so that sounds like a relief. I like a show that does sort of here's a bunch of different anthologies. So I'm very willing to start at
and it's also one where you can kind of I think for season 4 you really do have to watch it because facial expressions do factor in a bit, but with the previous seasons you can listen to it as
Oh,
if
wow.
it was a podcast, and it would be like just as interesting. So it reminded me a lot of like the Esther Perel podcast that I had put into group chat, I think the last time I was on.
Well, I'm dubbing the group chat, first of all, an opportunity for me to eat my words, because late last week I tweeted, I'm very sorry to this young boy who's half boy, half deer, but I'm just not going to find out what happens to you. It's like this new Netflix show that
Sweet Tooth or
looked
something?
bananas to me. Yeah, Sweet Tooth. And I unfortunately found myself watching the first episode and then watching the second episode and then being like, I'm a little invested in finding out what happens to this sweet little half boy, half deer creature person critter thing. And so I regret to do this, but I have to eat my words and say Sweet Tooth is highly watchable.
Wouldn't he just become the guy in the Fallout Boy video?
He is the guy in the Fallout Boy video.
Yeah,
That's exactly accurate.
Yeah, so that's what it is. It's like the whole backstory about the guy in the Fallout Boy video with the deer horns.
But it's based on a comic by a Canadian artist that got adapted into this show. And honestly, like, I will say the first trailer that I watched for it is like, it features this like very burly man who's like, young deer kid boy thing. Listen, the world is going to be very cruel to you. You better watch out. And I'm like, there's nothing there for me. And if you saw that trailer and if you, like me, foolishly thought, nope, can't relate and I'm not interested, I think you should give it a watch, because it's really well shot. It is well paced. The star of the show is so watchable. Like, he's just like a very good deer boy kid critter thing. And it's highly watchable. So watch Sweet Tooth on Netflix and then let's fight about it. Haggy, what about you? What would you like to drop?
So I've watched a show in the past, but like for some reason, the last like week or so, I'm just like, I can't stop thinking about it. And it's the History Channel's show called Alone. Do you guys know Alone?
No, I've never heard of it.
Hussein? No. Okay, so let me explain what Alone is to you guys. It is so crazy. It's like one of those things that like you should watch before bed because it'll just knock you out by how tired it makes you. And it's 10 people, and they are just really into wilderness survival, or like, as they constantly keep saying, primitive survival skills. And they are put in these very remote, crazy locations to survive as long as they can. So it's like, it can be like up to a year of them being totally remote by themselves. Like, they're not seeing each other, these 10 people. They're on like different parts of a place and they never see each other. And they just have to survive. They just have to survive alone. Like, so that means getting their food, building a shelter, like just the mental toll it takes of like not seeing anyone. They don't have any books. They have one photo of their families. It's all they're allowed.
Oh my God.
And it is so crazy. I feel every range of emotion when I watch Alone. You're just like, you know, you're so happy because they finally caught a fish, and the fish like slips out of their hands and swims away, and you're just like, and like sometimes like I have to turn it off. I'm like, I can't do this right now. Like I just can't handle them not eating, you know. And they will be like airlifted out if like things get too like if they begin starving for real. Like, they are forced to get out. Like, they have a medical check, and like if they weigh under a certain whatever, like they have to leave. Like if they get really severely injured and like they can't manage the infection, like they have to get out. If they break a bone, they have to get out. And sometimes they just have to tap out because they were like, I'm going crazy. Like I'm literally going insane. But mind you, they win $500,000 and they don't even talk about the money. They're like, yeah, the money would be cool, but I really want to just be able to do this. I want to be able to survive. And you're like, what? It's the best. It's all on, for some reason, a bunch of seasons are on Canopy right now, which is a free streaming service if you have a library card. But I'm sure it is found elsewhere if you do not have a library card, or if your library doesn't have Canopy. It is just, I mean, like, I need you both to watch this show.
I'm stressed out just hearing about it. Like, that sounds like not a fun reality show. Also, the idea of the production tail being like a year, like, we have no idea when they'll come out.
Also, like, it's crazy because I'm alone. I'm by myself in my apartment. I'm like, true. Yeah, it totally is like that, being by yourself.
It sounds so stressful. I'm gonna like binge watch it tonight.
Oh my god, please. I mean, the first couple seasons aren't like the best. Like they're finding their footing as far as like production and rules go. But it gets really, really amazing.
Well, if folks have other recommendations they'd like to drop us, we are at PopChat CBC. And follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss a single episode. Hussein, Sarah, what a pleasure.
This is the best.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us today on PopChat. This is the show where we help make sense of the cultural drama that is blowing up the internet. I'd like to thank our PopChat team, our showrunner, Emil Niazi, producer, Sarah Clayton, coordinating producer, Glory Omateo. Plus, our senior producer is Tina Verma. Our executive producer is Arif Nurani. I'm your host, Alamin Abdul Mahmoud. Let's do this again next week.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.